Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining as well. So, not going to say my name because you know it already. So, I'm a facilitator, team coach, and also kind of a trainer. But my role within Marmalade as kind of volunteer is Marmalade Companion. And today's session, a couple of things. If you can, it would be lovely if people had cameras on. And it's purely for that idea of feeling a little bit more connected as we talk through this. And I know some people can't have them on, but if you could, that would be great. We're going to be using the chat function today. So we're going to be using that for several little short questions, maybe as we go. But please feel free to put questions in there as well. We will, if we have time at the end, stop the recording to take any questions. But yeah, if we can keep mics off for the moment, that'd be great. Some of the things we just want to make you aware of, we know that sometimes the topic of loneliness might remind people of things, or they might want to continue the conversation. So we're not a 24-hour helpline, but we do take inbound kind of questions via email and so forth. So if you do want to ask something, we'll get back to you as soon as possible. But we do want to remind people that there are other organizations where they can go and talk to people directly. And some of you will have your employee system programs kind of built in as well. So just a reminder, it's not a big doom and gloom presentation. It's more about information and lifting some of the stigma away from this word loneliness. And thank you so much. Yeah, so many of you got cameras on. That's amazing. So during this session, we're going to talk a little bit about the Marmalade Trust itself. Oh, apologies. A little bit about the Marmalade Trust, who we are, what we do. A little bit about Loneliness Awareness Week to let you know when that is. Obviously, we're going to talk a bit about loneliness itself and why should we actually be thinking about it and talking about it. And then also how can Marmalade support other organizations as well. So let's start off with a bit of a number. This is some research that was done for the facts on loneliness by the Campaign to End Loneliness. And that's pretty much why the Marmalade Trust exists. Okay, that's quite a high number when we're looking at some of the statistics. But over a year ago, the World Health Organization actually released that loneliness is a pressing health threat. So they are now becoming much more aware of this and actually working on it as well. A little bit about us. Well, actually, we were set up in 2013. So we've been talking about loneliness for over 10 years now. And it was set up by a healthcare professional who was working with the NHS, but working in the community. What we do, we run direct support projects for people experiencing chronic loneliness. And I'll explain what chronic loneliness is later. We primarily do that in the Southwest because it's a very direct, you need to be within the region for supporting people. But we do support organizations around raising the awareness of loneliness throughout the UK and actually now some international work as well. I mentioned Loneliness Awareness Week, and that started in 2017. And that came about because our founder, Amy, was doing a doorstep visit. And it all came about because of flip-flops. Yes, Loneliness Awareness Week started because of flip-flops. So Amy was leaving a doorstep visit, and the person said, when we were saying goodbye, "Oh, did you know it's National Flip-Flop Appreciation Day today?" I shouldn't say it on a recorded webinar, but actually we think Amy might have flipped herself. We're talking about flip-flops, but we're not talking about loneliness. So actually things started in 2017 in relation to that. And I'm going to read this because sometimes people are busy working or they're just listening to it as they're going for a walk. But our mission is to create a society where we recognize that loneliness exists and we support each other to find new social connections. And that is our focus. One thing that we do believe is that everybody will experience loneliness at some point in their lives. And this can be due to many different events, factors, changes in people's life. But actually people don't often recognize and or acknowledge it. That's one of the big key things. Now, we want you to take away some golden bits of nuggets of information. And one of them is, a lot of them actually, they come from us having conversations with people. We hear what people are assuming and what they're saying. So one of the things is it's important to know that loneliness is not a mental health condition. But we will speak later about how it impacts on specific types of loneliness and have on health and well-being. But it is not a mental health condition. Why did these webinars come about? Well, a couple of years ago, you might remember the Mental Health Awareness Week, they used the word loneliness. So we had lots of organization contacting us saying, can we have more information? So we designed these webinars to be able to do this. Normally we do a longer one, which is about an hour, but I know today we've got 30 minutes. But it is the fact that more organisations, and we'll say the names because they gave us permission, anywhere from Transport for London, KFC, WH Smith, Selfridges, have all kind of actually bringing this conversation into the workplace, which is fantastic. So, Loneliness Awareness Week, I mentioned how it started, but we have lots of things that happen during June. Now, we started this regionally, then it went nationally, and then what ended up happening was that we now have people all over the world in lots of different countries talking about the idea of actually how do we connect? How do we talk about loneliness? How do we try and reduce the stigma around loneliness? And one of the campaigns that we put a theme to it every year was actually the make a random act of connection, allowing people to feel okay with talking with sometimes strangers, sometimes actually colleagues that they haven't before. So it's a really good week. Put it in your calendars. It's in June. You'll see it on our website. So we talked a little bit about us as an organization. Now we're actually going to talk about the word that we hear I've used multiple times, and it's that idea of loneliness. And what I'd like you to do is in the chat, if you could get access to it, I'd just like you to put in whatever words you associate with loneliness. You can put in 1, 2, 3, as many as you want. So just populate that chat. And as we know, this won't be in the recording, so I'll be using some of these words when I'm going to be talking. Brilliant. Keep them coming through. So we got the idea of sad and sadness, the idea of disconnected, the idea of on my own. We got the idea of dark. Okay. The idea of disappearing, not being visible, fear, alone, no purpose, nothing to do, feeling isolated. All right. And as we can see that there's a lot of interconnected kind of words there, but everybody's coming with different bits and pieces. And that's why we always share what we use as a definition for loneliness. And again, I will read it just so you have the opportunity if you're listening. So we define it as loneliness, and we use this definition. So as a subjective, unwelcome feeling of lack or loss of companionship. And it happens when we have a mismatch between the quantity and the quality of social relationships that we have and those that we want. Okay? So regardless of nationality, age, race, religion, where you've come from, all of that, we are all human beings. And that means that we need to have some type of social contact. Okay? Now, if we look back at the second word in the definition, it's subjective. And we see that with all the words coming through in the chat. It is subjective. Loneliness is a natural feeling. It isn't pleasant, all right? It's not a pleasant emotion. It's something that feels, quite often people say, unwelcome, but we know it feels different for everybody. So at a kind of a very basic level, it's that feeling of being disconnected. It's the mismatch between what you have and what you want as social connections. And the word want in there is a massive word because not everybody knows or takes time to understand what they want in social connections. But if we go back to, we know it's subjective, but no matter your situation you're in, loneliness is a natural human feeling, but it's also part of our biology. So we, believe it or not, are biologically wired to need contact with individuals. And this comes from when we had to, as human beings evolving, our way of survival was acting together. So gathering food, staying safe against predators, right? And that's why it's evolved into what we call an emotional motivator. In other words, it's a warning signal to respond to what we need in a timely way. And to meet that need, it's about social connections. So we're supposed to feel this. Just like if we look at things like hunger, okay? What we know we need to do is source food, and then we know that we need to actually eat the food. Again, with thirst, what do? We have to source. Our want is liquid, our action is to drink. And with loneliness, we know that we need to have social connections of some type. We need to actually then find people and make those connections. So that's where there's, you know, it is in our biology. We're supposed to do it. And one thing that we try to do at this point is to differentiate between loneliness and social isolation, which I always find difficult to say. So when we're defining it, there is a difference between them. Loneliness is subjective because you can actually feel lonely in a room full of people, whereas social isolation is where you are apart or not in contact with people, whether this is desired or not. Some people actually do like to be alone. With some people, it's not an option and they feel socially isolated. So, social isolation commonly results in loneliness, but that's not always the case. But it's just that to remember, you can still feel lonely in a room full of people. As academics and psychologists talk about different types of loneliness, some say that there's only two different types of loneliness, some say that there's up to 100. As an organization, we're not going to be talking about 100 different types of loneliness. We focus on these five. So emotional loneliness is when you don't have it's also called intimate loneliness, when you don't have that special person where you share those everyday little things, that deep, meaningful connection with bond or trust. And sometimes people experience it because of a loss of a loved one. Sometimes it's more to do with actually they don't have regular contact with somebody that they just get on with. Transient loneliness is something that comes and goes. It could be because you've moved work or because you just experience a change in friendship groups. But it's that type of loneliness that comes and goes. Situational loneliness has to do with stuff like Christmas, bank holidays, Sundays, around your birthday, where your previous connections around those times are no longer there. And actually, these are the times that you feel more lonely. So bank holidays, quite often people say they feel lonely because everybody goes off and does stuff. Social, and it's that idea of the not having those bigger connections with people, those circle of friends, those teams that you belong to, where you just have that bigger gathering around you. And quite often people refer back to that thing that happened a couple of years ago. A lot of people then realize that those social connections were so important, those bigger groups. They stopped volunteering, they stopped going to work drinks on a Friday night, all this type of thing. And chronic loneliness is the one that I mentioned, which is much more, we go into much more detail that in our other webinar, because it's the one that has the impact on our health and well-being. Chronic loneliness is that idea of feeling alone all or most of the time. People use the word that it's kind of enduring, it's heavy, it's constantly there. And this impacts on people in lots of different ways. So for some, people experience a low mood. So chronic loneliness can impact on your mood. And that then also can impact on sleep. But again, it's subjective. Some people end up sleeping much more. Some people sleep much less. So there is a change. People change eating habits and what they consume. Some people will end up eating more. Some people will end up eating less. We talked to one person who had one of our doorstep visits, and just basically one of our volunteers goes and have a chat on a doorstep just to keep that sense of safety, security. And they came and they messaged us the next day and they said after that conversation, they actually went and cooked for themselves for the first time in 3 weeks because all they were doing was just having little bites. So really important to understand that the power of conversation. And we know that impacts on people's habits. And again, sometimes as people will change how they consume, let's say, cigarettes or how they consume alcohol, all right, and it has that impact on it. For some, actually, the social aspect, socializing, can change when they're experiencing loneliness. For some, they will withdraw. They won't go to after work events or they won't meet up and go for a walk. Others actually when they do get to work, they may be talking even more. And that's their way. They just talk much more because they maybe are going home and not talking from 5 o'clock till 9 o'clock the next day. Literally not just using this voice. So the communication can change. And then the impact, especially with chronic loneliness on health, is the one that we always say that please seek medical attention because it does have an impact on your health if left not spoken about. And the numbers when it comes to chronic loneliness are, unfortunately, they're going up. It's expected that by the end of next year that there will be over 50s, there'll be 2 million people experiencing loneliness, chronic loneliness. We know in the pandemic, it went from 2.5 million people in general to 3.7 million people experiencing loneliness. So that's one of the things that's so important to know about it. But research does show that chronic loneliness is associated with poor physical and mental health and lower well-being. In particular, loneliness amongst older people is often linked to depression. People are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease if they have a high degree of loneliness that they're experiencing. Other impacts, chronic loneliness actually is worse for you than obesity and also can increase the risk of developing coronary heart disease, strokes, and high blood pressure. And that's why we say it is really important that people seek medical support from their GPs if they think that they're experiencing chronic loneliness, which is that all or most of the time feeling this enduring aloneness. So that's a quick insight, because we are conscious of time, a quick insight to there are different types of loneliness. And sometimes by just knowing that and knowing to be able to have a conversation around it can be really, really powerful for people. But there are other impacts of loneliness. So if we look at this, I'm going to give you another quick question in the chat. But when we look at what's called disconnected communities, okay, how much money do you think disconnected communities cost the UK economy each year? And loneliness is a big part of what's defined to define disconnected communities. So I'll give you a moment while I listen to my body and have a drink. Like a couple of options coming through already. Again, we won't be calling out who's right and who's wrong, but there's a variety of answers coming in. So I'll give you the answer. It's actually 32 billion. It's a massive impact. And this research was commissioned by the Eden Project Initiative, the Big Lunch. Right, so disconnected communities cost that to the economy. When we look at employers, we often get asked a question. So the cost to employers has now been loneliness as a direct impact on 2.5 billion every year. I'm going to show you a graph. So if you watch the video afterwards, you can pause it because we'll go through it quite quickly. But one of the biggest things is staff turnover. Okay, so loneliness has a direct impact on the equivalent value of 1.6 billion every year to employers. And that's why it's so important. And it's brilliant that Thrive got us in to be able to have this conversation, to let employers know that this is something which can impact. When we talk about loneliness, we also talk about, well, when does it happen? When do people experience it? So we talk about what's called key life indicators. And in our other webinar, we go into a bit more detail. But key life indicators are those times in people's lives when things are changing. Now, we did spend as a team, and we got up to 200 of these we could figure out, but we focus on these 15. And as employers, team leaders, employees, all of these things will happen. No, a lot of these things will happen to people already, or they're actually going to be in the future, or they're experiencing these now. And these are times where people can say that they're experiencing loneliness. Okay. So it's just those things about retirement, who's having a conversation with somebody who's leaving work and actually putting stuff in place that they realize, actually, yeah, I'm not going to have these social connections. So they're just a couple of them for you to have a look at. We know that the benefits, so the impact of loneliness can be huge on both individuals, the economy, and the workplace. However, on the flip side, having good quality, meaningful connections in the workplace is directly associated with better outcomes, higher well-being, greater quality of work, right? And that's why it's really important to have these conversations, or just to have the information available for people to dip into. And we talk about where you can get some more of that in a bit. So a little bit about how can we support. Okay, so we've gone through this process already, but how do we support people, or how can you as individuals, whether it's in family, friends, or in the workplace? And firstly, it's actually about how, when people talk to us, they say, how do we talk about loneliness? So one of the things that we say is actually openly and honestly. Okay, that's really important. We know that there's lots of stigma attached to it. So it's really important that we don't perpetuate this, that we don't add to it, remembering that loneliness is a natural emotion that we should be experiencing. So openly and honestly, people are quite often surprised when I tell them that I've experienced loneliness. They're like, but you're chatty, you're very sociable, all of that. But for me, one of the key life indicators was when I adopted my son as a single person. Well, I was in every evening, and I really didn't think about that. I knew it, but I didn't think about that. And actually, one of my ways taking action once I'd acknowledged loneliness was this plastic stuff behind me, which we won't name because we can't promote brands. Um, but there was some of that left on the table from playtime, and I just picked it up, started doing stuff with it. Kind of liked it. Didn't have it as a kid because my brother had it, and I had the farm animals. And it was kind of, so I went and bought myself some. And then I maybe bought myself some more. But then I found that there was lots of communities. So AFOLs, adult fans of that stuff. Um, and actually started making connections there, having a way to talk about something with people that I didn't really know, but it gave me those more meaningful connections. And please, the language that we use is so important. We don't use the word suffering. We don't say admitting or tackling. We don't use those words when we talk about thirst or hunger. So why are we talking about them when it's loneliness? You'll hear some of my language I've been using. It's acknowledging. That's what we're doing, right? It's how are we going to make those new social connections? But remembering that it is a natural thing that we're supposed to experience. As a trust, when we're talking with people, we have a kind of what we use as a three-step approach. First of all, it's back to that word acknowledge. It's really important that we actually get to the point of acknowledging loneliness for ourselves or supporting somebody, and learning how to actually sit with that feeling, understanding that feeling, whatever it might be, how we define it for ourselves. And then it's actually about what we identify. So for some people, they need to identify what type of loneliness they're experiencing. They might need to identify that they need to learn more about loneliness. They might need to identify actually what is it, the type of social connections that I want. Is it groups of people? Is it one-to-one? Is it online? What is it? That actually they need to identify those things, because we know, again, back to that word, it's subjective for actually everybody. And then it's about taking action. And that is something that really is important that we do. Start small was one of the things. Okay. Can be quite overwhelming, but also exciting when people acknowledge for themselves that they're experiencing loneliness. And these lovely devices that glow type thing, they're brilliant. But actually don't compare yourself. Right? People only put the good stuff on there, right? They might be going home, they might be going back to feeling lonely as well. Um, Talking to others is that idea of finding the person to be able to talk to. For some, they need the support in exploring the topic of loneliness. Making a plan is one of the most crucial things. Think of these key life indicators. If you are experiencing loneliness, make a plan. What are those little incremental changes you're going to make? What are those little connections that you can start doing? Whether it's going on a weekly walk with somebody, whether it's going to the same coffee shop, right? And actually just being around people, connecting with the staff, maybe getting to know their name. And one of the biggest things is the idea of being kind to yourself. If you're experiencing loneliness, you might be experiencing low mood. The idea of being kind to yourself, people just don't sometimes. What are those little things you can do to be kind to yourself? For some, it's going and getting a posh coffee. Yes, it's a stupid price, but actually that's been for them as a treat. For some, it's actually going and spending a silly price in a cinema. Yes, you're going by yourself, but you might feel less lonely because you're listening to other people laughing and giggling around you. So those things are really important to think, actually, that taking the 3 steps to acknowledge, to identify, and then to actually take action. But a really important part around that is about talking to others, exploring it, having those kind of questions like, so what is it you really would like to do? What is it that you feel like would help you with your connections? So we do have a list of resources, and I know I'm putting a hyperlink into PowerPoint, the irony of it, but on our website, we have been spending so much over the last year or two for everything from advice for parents, for carers, for ways of making connections. And then, as I said, we do have Loneliness Awareness Week, all right? And that's coming up in June. Lots of ways you can get involved, just sharing it. If there are any further questions, you've got my email there, but you can find the main email address on the website as well, so the info one. But again, kind of going back, what we were hoping throughout the session, which I didn't actually share at the beginning, I realize, is that one person will acknowledge that they've experienced loneliness themselves. Maybe that one person will tell somebody, they'll feel comfortable now to talk about loneliness and tell someone. And that one person may take action in relation to loneliness. Now, I'm just going to, you've seen this slide, it's just a quick reminder. I'm just going to share with you a couple of questions. I'm going to respond to them that came through on the form already. And I'll leave you with that. So bear with me while I go to another slide. I'm conscious of people's diaries. So if you need to dial off, please do so. How can managers support their teams to identify someone who might be experiencing loneliness? I would suggest we don't use the word identify. I would say, who's the person that we might want to open up a conversation with or share something about the webinar today? Some nuggets of information that you thought, oh, actually, did you know that there's hundreds of different types of loneliness? All right. Or did you know that there's a website? There's actually an organization who's a leading loneliness charity who can support with getting resources. Are there any online Zoom chats for people who are lonely? Not specifically, but what we always recommend is go back to what you're interested in. So for me, that stuff. Find an Eventbrite, find the what you call those meetup. Go and search for where there are those things online, because the conversation for connection doesn't have to be around loneliness. It can be about what you're interested in. Somebody's mentioned this idea about feeling lonely in a room full of people. Yes, we've commented on that, but yes, and sometimes I said even with our friends. And that is about acknowledging that sometimes we're not getting what we need from the people we identify as friends. You can still be friends, but there's something that you are maybe missing in your connections with them, in your conversations. How can organizations and businesses help reduce loneliness within the workforce, especially people who work from home or solo? Well, our advice is that we cannot put a price on actually bringing people together if possible. We know it can be expensive, but actually the value of it. So I run a facilitation business. We gather people together in organizations to run events with them. And we always hear at the end of it, it was so good to be back in the room with people. Sometimes they completely forget what I've been talking to them about. And then around the definitions of loneliness, there was the questions there. So we have some stats around the age ranges and so forth online. So we haven't got time to go through them now, but you will find that online. But yes, going back, this is one of those things that actually having conversation around it, reducing the stigma, understanding that loneliness is a natural emotion that we're supposed to feel. It is our body telling us that we need to get some social connections, and acknowledging it, identifying what you need, and then taking action are the key ways to approach it. So we have got other webinars and support available if people do want to get in contact with us. In a moment, we'll stop the recording if anybody does want to stop and ask any questions.